Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Souvenirs by Herman Landon, author of Built for Weight. Detective Story Magazine, January 13th, 1920. With a sardonic smile creasing his face, the Honorable Tristan Shelby, mayor of Owana City, thrust the pistol against his temple. The steel felt cold to his feverishly burning flesh and sent a series of icy vibrations through his body. His eyes moved to the softly ticking clock on the mantel-shelf, and he noticed that it lacked only a few minutes of 8. On the stroke of the hour, he would press the trigger. He gave a short, hoarse chuckle as he formed the decision, marveling at the composure and indifference with which he found himself awaiting the end. To die, he reflected grimly, was not nearly so hard as he had supposed, and it required less courage than to face defeat, disgrace, and ruin. It was as simple an ordeal as the snuffing out of a candle and a swift plunge into the ensuing darkness. As he counted the seconds, his past life paraded in rapid review before his inner vision. His lips tightened as he recalled the wild and tempestuous years he had spent in the far west when, as a soldier of fortune and irresponsible vagabond, he had drunk the cup of life down to the last bitter dregs. There was one scene, blacker and more sordid than the others, that caused him to wince as it flashed across the screen of his recollections. He had tried to forget it, to live it down, but he had succeeded only partially. Pelton Cosgrove, corrupt political boss of Owana City, had not permitted him to forget. "Damn him," he muttered, clutching the pistol more tightly. Scene by scene, the picture of his life passed on before his narrowing eyes. The frenzied period of his youth had been followed by years of atonement and reparation, during which his old self had been all but obliterated. Driven onward by a powerful ambition and aided by abounding physical and mental energies, he had climbed high in the political life of Owana City, the hustling manufacturing town that he had chosen as the scene of his regeneration. Already he was being mentioned for the governorship, from which the path pointed straight to the United States Senate. He shrugged, realizing that the black shadow of Pelton Cosgrove had always stood in the way of his ambitions. His dreams and hopes had been ground to dust under the ruthless iron heel of the corrupt boss, until finally he had been compelled to choose between the alternatives of ruin and death. He had chosen what to him seemed the lesser evil of the two. The minute hand of the clock moved at a snail's pace, while his thoughts raced on. The steadiness with which he held the pistol amazed him, yet there was something awesome in the thought that in a few moments he would be a crumpled heap of inert matter. In the morning, life would go on as before, but he would no longer be a part of it, and his niche in the world would soon be filled. He wondered what Olive Armstrong would think, but he quickly banished the question from his mind. What the others would think did not matter greatly. The suicide of the Honorable Tristan Shelby would naturally create a sensation, and for a time there would be all sorts of wild speculations and surmises. It was even possible that some of them would guess his secret and divine his motive. However that might be, he knew that a suicide is usually looked upon as a coward and a quitter. Coward, quitter. He spoke the two words aloud, wondering why the sound of his voice grated unpleasantly on his senses. Until this moment, he had thought of suicide only as a convenient means of escape from an intolerable situation. The two short words, reviving a slumbering instinct in his consciousness, brought him up with a jerk. "Coward, quitter," he repeated. The clock was doling out 8 dulcet strokes, but he scarcely heard them. As the seconds sped by, the reawakening instinct became more clamorous and insistent, instilling a new spirit in his being. In the old days, he had gambled furiously and recklessly, often staking his future on the turn of a card or the caprices of a wheel. but he had always given himself a gambler's chance. Now, he reflected, he was tossing his life away without allowing himself the slightest chance. A new light dawned in his steely eyes as he glanced at the clock. A few minutes more or less don't matter, he told himself. I'll make one more appeal to Dame Chance. Taking a coin from his pocket, he regarded it speculatively and with a trace of veneration, as if the little metal piece were symbolic of fate. If heads, I go and beard old Cosgrove in his lair. If tails, I blow my brains out. Here goes. He smiled as he flipped the coin and watched it spin through the air. After numerous tiny revolutions, it fell to the table with a little thud, and he bent over and gazed at it anxiously. Heads, he declared. Shelby rose with a resolute air, put the pistol in his hip pocket, and donned hat and coat, meanwhile rehearsing in his mind the ensuing scene with Cosgrove. As he passed down the stairs, he encountered his housekeeper, a buxom person with an ineradicable grin on her rubicund face. Being in too great a hurry to listen to her well-meant pleasantries, he brusquely announced that he was going out and might not be back until late. 20 minutes later, he was ringing the doorbell of Pelton Cosgrove's pretentious stone mansion in the fashionable quarter of the city. "Mr. Cosgrove is busy just now, sir," announced the stony-faced butler who responded to his ring. "If you will wait, I will," announced Shelby shortly, guessing that the boss was in conference with a henchman. The servant ushered him into a parlor adjoining the den in which Cosgrove received visitors and transacted business. In a few minutes, the inner door opened, and a lubberly, sleek-faced individual stepped out of the sanctum of the boss. He glanced diffidently at Shelby as the butler hurried forward with his hat and stick. Evidently, his conference with Cosgrove had been of a private and delicate nature. Shelby nodded curtly, for he had never liked Masterson, president of the Board of Aldermen, and one of Cosgrove's most intimate associates. Without waiting for the butler to announce him, he stepped to the door, pushed it open, and unceremoniously entered. "Hello, Cosgrove," was his bluff greeting. The big man seated at a flat-top desk looked up from a stack of documents. There were heavy pouches under his sharp, deep-set eyes. The immense dome of his head was quite bald, and the flesh hung in flaccid layers about his jowls. A huge diamond flashed and glittered in his somewhat florid cravat, and his clothes were of gaudy hue and sportive design. Chewing a long black cigar, he looked at his visitor with an air of peevish impatience. "Ah, you, Shelby," he remarked indifferently, lowering his eyes to the papers on the desk. "Want anything in particular?" The mayor drew up a chair and sat down on the opposite side of the desk. There was a metallic glint in his eyes, and his clean-cut jaw jutted out belligerently, but the boss pretended absorption in the papers before him and was unaware of these signs of aggressiveness on the part of his visitor. "I received your note asking me to support the traction grab," announced Shelby levelly. "Just a matter of form," grumbled the boss, running his eyes over a typewritten page. "It's a rather raw deal, and the boys in the council will feel better about it if you get yourself interviewed and tell the public that the thing is on the square. You've got quite a pull among the psalm singers, you know, and your say-so goes a long way." Shelby's strong and rugged features darkened ominously. "As I understand the situation," he remarked, "it is proposed to make the traction company a present of several acres of municipal property in the southeastern outskirts of the city." "You got it doped out just about right," said the boss. "The land is no good to the city. It's nothing but a swamp, but the company will improve it and build a powerhouse on it. It will be a good thing for the town, and everybody ought to be satisfied. But some of these confounded reformers are already setting up a howl. That's why we want you to okay the proposition." A thin smile parted the mayor's lips. "The property ought to be worth at least $1 million to the traction company," he pointed out, "and yet the city isn't going to get a cent for it." Cosgrove looked up, a surly expression in his eyes. "Say," he demanded raspingly, "what are you driving at?" Seems to me you're singing a new tune tonight. What's the idea? Shelby drew up his wiry, athletic figure and regarded the boss fixedly. I will tell you, he said quietly. I held an executive session with my soul tonight. For several years, first as an alderman and later as mayor, I've danced to your piping, Cosgrove. Because you've had me where you wanted me, I've done things that make me ashamed to look the janitors and scrub women at the city hall in the face. It started innocently enough, with me humoring you in minor matters that involved little more than my self-respect, but you've been getting more hoggish all the time, asking me to do things that are downright criminal. It's got to stop. So that's it. The boss leaned his bulky form against the back of the chair, inserted his thumbs in the armpits of his vest, and regarded the mayor sneeringly. That's the way you feel about it, is it? Exactly. Long ago, while you and I knew each other out west, I made the resolution that if the time ever came when I couldn't live my life the way I wanted to live it, I would jump off. I mean to stick to that resolution. You've been leading me around by the leash long enough, Cosgrove. Already I have done some things that would interest the grand jury, and if matters go on as they have been going, I will soon face exposure and ruin. As you know, I've got a lot of ambition in my makeup. I am either going to succeed or die. If I fail, life won't mean anything to me. An hour ago I had made up my mind that I'd reached the end of the rope. I meant to put a bullet through my head and sidestep the grand smash that's bound to come if you continue persecuting me. Maybe it was foolish, but that's the way I felt about it. However, the old gambling instinct urged me to give myself one more chance, and that's why I am here. Quite a pretty speech. Cosgrove's face creased into a leer. I suppose the idea is that if I don't promise to let up on you, you'll go home and drill a hole through your head. I think not. I've gotten over that fool notion in the last hour. I'm going to fight you, Cosgrove. Fight you to a finish. Get that? Unless you promise on oath that you will stop bothering me, I'll go to the district attorney and turn state's evidence against you. An ugly sneer formed about Cosgrove's lips. Haven't you forgotten something, Shelby? What about the pretty Miss Armstrong? Won't she throw a fit when she learns what kind of man her fiancé is? Leave her out of it, snapped Shelby, his face reddening. I don't mind telling you, though, that my inability to face her as a disgraced and ruined man was the main reason why I was tempted to kill myself a while ago. Don't you dare to mention her name again. All right then, but here's another thing you seem to have forgotten. If you squeal, I'll squeal too, and I can squeal a darn sight louder than you. You haven't forgotten that little mix-up you were in out west, eh, Shelby? No, I haven't, declared the younger man evenly. You haven't let me forget it. You've been holding that incident over my head for several years, making me do your dirty work by threatening to tell the police that I am. He checked himself abruptly and looked quickly about the room. Don't get nervous, admonished Cosgrove. The walls are pretty thick and nobody's listening. Yep, I guess the police would sit up and take notice if I told them that you're Dick Saylor, the guy that croaked a saloon keeper in Oklahoma about 9 years ago. Shelby winced a little, and his momentary confusion seemed to inspire the boss with fresh confidence. It would make a pretty story in the papers, he went on in gloating accents. The Honorable Tristan Shelby, mayor of Owana City, shown up as a murderer. Great little sensation, eh? If you're lucky, you'll be let off with a stretch in the pen. Otherwise, it will be the electric chair for yours. Pleasant prospect, eh? The other's face was white and tense. I was drunk when I did that killing, he muttered, and I acted partly in self-defense. Anyhow, the saloon keeper was a cur. He had been insulting a woman when I interfered. He got only what was coming to him. Oh, sure, but will the jury believe it? I've tried to live it down, continued Shelby. You know I've been going it straight ever since I came out of the West, and if there was a spark of human feeling in you, you would give me a chance. Very pretty, said Cosgrove, chuckling sarcastically. Now we'll chuck the fine speeches and get down to business. You can't afford to have me drop as much as a hint that you're Dick Saylor. The sensation would kill you deader than a doornail. See this telephone? I want you to call up the Morning Star and dictate an interview to the effect that the traction bill is on the square and a good thing for the town. The mayor drew himself up. His mouth was a thin, tight line, and something blazed in the narrow slits of his eyes. Suppose I refuse? Cosgrove consulted his watch ostentatiously. It's now 9:30, he remarked. Unless you call up the Star within 10 minutes, I'll hand you over to the police. After that, you can turn all the state's evidence you want to. I guess my word is as good as a murderer's any old time. You rat, exclaimed Shelby loathingly. In order to graft a few dirty dollars from the Traction Trust, you would ruin a man's life. You're about as low as they come, Cosgrove. The boss grinned complacently and placed the watch before him on the desk. Fine talk don't go with me. You'll either give that interview to the Star or go to jail. I don't care which you do, as a matter of fact. I've got to have a man in the mayor's chair that'll listen to reason and common sense. Blood surged hotly to Shelby's head. His wrath was fanned by the smug grin on Cosgrove's face and the self-satisfied twinkle in the cunning eyes. His clenched fist itched, but, remembering the disagreeable predicaments into which his quick temper and fiery impulsiveness had led him in the past, he strove hard for self-control. Half the time's up, announced the boss, glancing significantly at the telephone. Better decide, quick. Shelby gritted his teeth and squared his jaw. The traction bill was the most barefaced fraud at which Cosgrove had ever asked his connivance, and by endorsing it, he would alienate his most influential supporters and incur the contempt of his friends. As for Olive Armstrong, he would never again be able to meet the calm, searching gaze of her sky-blue eyes. I have already decided, he declared evenly. I won't support your rotten traction bill. I'll see myself in Hades first. You got only half a minute more, placidly remarked the boss, chewing his cigar. The younger man sat rigid and tight-lipped, restraining an insane impulse to leap at the throat of the boss. The watch on the table was loudly ticking off the seconds. Cosgrove's face, its little purplish splotches accentuated by the droplight above his head, wore a maddening grin. Presently the boss rose, sauntered about the room, then stopped abruptly at the door. With a quick motion, he turned the key in the lock and put it in his pocket. The time's up, he declared with a raucous chuckle. I'll now call up the police and tell them to come to my house and arrest the Honorable Tristan Shelby, alias Dick Saylor, on a charge of murder. Shelby did not move a muscle. For a moment, as Cosgrove's chubby hand moved toward the telephone, he was conscious of nothing but a sense of impending crash. While the boss had no documentary evidence, the fact that Tristan Shelby and Dick Saylor were identical could easily be established once the police had been given a hint to that effect. The mayor saw the fat, slimy hand grip the instrument and lift it from the desk. Now Cosgrove had removed the hook and was waiting for the operator to answer his signal. Things swam before Shelby's eyes. His only clear thought was that all in life that mattered was trembling in the balance. In the next instant, his senses galvanized by the impulse of self-preservation, he had leaped to his feet. Instinctively, his hand darted to his hip pocket and snatched out the pistol. "Stop!" he cried in a voice of desperate determination, at the same moment pointing the weapon straight at Cosgrove's head. An ashen tint spread slowly over the lumpy countenance of the boss, and a sagging of the jowls and a widening of the piggy eyes hinted at his consternation. "Put it down," ordered Shelby, indicating the instrument with a flourish of the pistol. Cosgrove removed the receiver from his ear. For an instant he seemed about to obey, but the mayor detected a crafty gleam in the bleary eyes. And then, with a quickness astounding in a man of his bulk, the boss dodged aside, tautening the long cord attached to the telephone, balanced it for an instant, and hurled the instrument at Shelby with savage force. In the same moment, a scream sounded. Shelby had an uncanny sensation that it had not come from Cosgrove's lips, but had burst out of nowhere. He had no time to think, for a second later, a roar, long drawn out and thunderously loud, split the brief interval of silence. The telephone crashed to the floor, and the hulky figure of the boss dropped like a dead weight over the arms of the chair. Shelby stood rigidly still, gazing absently at the wisp of smoke that fluttered at the muzzle of his pistol. Moving as one in a dream, he crossed to the other side of the desk, mechanically picked up the telephone, and restored it to its place. With the dazed expression of one emerging from a dream, he stared at the form sprawling across the chair. Cosgrove lay with head slanting downward, and a crimson stream trickling from a wound near the temple was forming zigzagging streaks across his bald head. "Dead," muttered the mayor. "I've killed him." Yet he had no recollection of pressing the trigger or even aiming the pistol. His muscles, rather than his mind, must have acted when he fired the shot. Perhaps his fingers had contracted in an involuntary spasm as the instrument was flung at him. However that might be, there could be no doubt that the boss had died by his hand. The barrel of his pistol was yet warm, and a faint curl of smoke was still issuing from the muzzle. He tossed the revolver on the desk and peered down at the gaping lips and lifelessly staring eyes of the dead man. A slowly advancing tinge of grayness was suffusing the flabby features, now gradually congealing into an expression of rigidity that sent a shiver of horror down Shelby's spine. The house was very still. Evidently the shot, which to Shelby's ear had sounded like a prolonged roar of cannon, had not penetrated the walls. For the moment at least he was safe, but he knew that his security could not last long. His head felt a little dazed, and he was unable to think clearly. But he wondered whether he would be able to explain convincingly that the shooting had been unintentional. It would be difficult to do that, he reflected, without revealing his relations to the dead man and exposing that episode of his past which had hung like a shadow over his life. No, he decided grimly, explanations would be worse than useless. It was with a shock that the seriousness of his predicament came to him. If he should be arrested, it would be impossible for him to establish a satisfactory alibi, for his housekeeper had seen him leave the house a little after 8, and Masterson and the butler knew that he had been alone with Cosgrove. The police, no doubt, would unearth a mass of clues pointing to him as the slayer, and against such evidence his standing and reputation would avail but little. His senses reeled, and the only idea that stood out clearly from the jumble of his thoughts and emotions was that he must flee. It was a galling thought, for it meant that he must surrender all that he had gained and be forced to begin life over again in another place and under another name. His flight would be accepted by his friends as conclusive proof of his guilt. His enemies would gloat over his disgrace. Olive Armstrong would. Shelby did not finish the thought. Deep in his consciousness there awoke the same rebellious instinct that had stayed his hand when he had been on the point of blowing out his brains. "Don't be a quitter," said a whispering voice. "Why don't you give yourself a gambler's chance?" A despairing smile curled his lips. He doubted whether he had even a ghost of a chance. In the morning the finger of suspicion would be pointed at him, which meant that his early past would be revealed in all its sordidness. What was worse still, he must decide and act quickly, for in a short while it would be too late. If he had only a few hours in which to consider the situation coolly and plan a course of action, perhaps he would find a way out. Once the body was discovered, he knew, it would take the police only a short time to ascertain his guilt. Without doubt, Barney Logan himself would take charge of the case, and Logan was one of the astutest and most subtle-witted detectives Shelby had ever known. His mind sometimes worked in strange channels, but it always worked swiftly and surely. Unlike the majority of his kind, when at work on a case he always viewed the obvious solution with suspicion, preferring to rely on such obscure clues as the average detective usually overlooks or ignores. To Logan's mind, the mere fact that a mass of clues pointed to the guilt of a certain individual was almost conclusive proof that the individual was innocent, and results had more than once vindicated his theory. Shelby's figure straightened as these thoughts surged through his aching mind. An idea, a daring and spectacular one, was slowly taking shape in his brain. The old reckless gleam returned to his eyes as he considered its possibilities, finally deciding that he could lose nothing by taking a long and desperate chance. "It's crazy, but it's my only hope," he told himself. "I'll stake my life on Barney Logan." He chuckled musingly as he went about his strange task. First, he examined the pistol, noting that the chamber contained one exploded shell and that his fingerprints were clearly impressed on the metal. Then he tossed it carelessly on the floor. Next, he took pains to distribute the imprints of his fingers on the smooth mahogany surface of the desk and on the oak panel door. He drew out his handkerchief, glanced at the embroidered monogram in one corner, and dropped it beside the chair. Noticing that there was a thin layer of dust on a spot of uncovered floor space in one corner of the room, he planted his foot on it squarely, producing a clear-cut design. Finally, he removed one of his golden cuff shields, engraved with the initial S, and threw it down beside the dead man's feet. Not yet satisfied with the thoroughness of his scheme, he took a knife from his pocket, cut a tuft of hair from the back of his head, and entwined the strands about one of the dead man's fingers. The hair, together with the cuff shield on the floor, would indicate that a struggle had taken place between the murderer and his victim before the shot was fired. Finally, he removed the key from the dead man's pocket and unlocked the door. Tarrying for a moment, he glanced about the room. "It's crazy as the dickens, but it's my only chance," he soliloquized. His eyes strayed to the body. "Too bad, old chap, but I don't know that you didn't have it coming to you." Opening the door, he sauntered leisurely toward the vestibule. There he was met by the butler, who evidently had heard him open and close the door. "Your hat, sir," announced the servant. Shelby gazed at him curiously as he accepted the derby, for it struck him that there was something peculiar about the man's appearance. Unable to account for the impression, he lit a cigar, walked out of the house, and swung briskly down the street. "It was my one chance," he told himself again. "I might have run away, of course, but I'm not a quitter. I know exactly what Barney Logan will think when he sizes up that layout." Chapter 2. Barney Logan, inspector of the Detective Bureau, a tall, lean man with straw-colored hair, good-humored but somewhat clownish features, and a perpetual twinkle in his mild blue eyes, listened patiently while Sergeant Aspwell explained what he had discovered prior to his chief's arrival on the scene of the murder. "As near as I can make out, sir," concluded the sergeant, "Mayor Shelby was the last man to see the big boss alive. Williams, the butler, says the mayor came a little after 9 and left a few minutes before 10. About 10:30, the butler began to wonder why Cosgrove wasn't turning in at his usual time. He stepped in here to investigate and almost dropped dead from shock when he saw the body. As soon as he had recovered part of his wits, he telephoned headquarters. "You don't suppose the mayor—" "I'm not supposing anything just now, Sergeant," drawled Logan softly. True to an inborn habit of laziness, he had been late in reaching the scene of the crime. "Has the coroner been here?" he added. "He left just before you came, sir. He said the bullet seemed to have taken a slanting course through Cosgrove's head and caused instant death." "Slanting?" echoed the inspector, looking up from his contemplation of a series of finger marks on the mahogany surface of the desk. "Are you sure he said slanting?" "That's what he said, sir. He told me it was a downward slant." "That's queer." The inspector glanced at the crumpled heap sprawling across the chair. "Cosgrove and Shelby are of about the same height, aren't they?" "Just about, sir." The sergeant blinked his eyes, as if unable to catch the drift of his chief's questions. And Cosgrove must have been standing when he was shot, or he wouldn't have fallen across the chair in that particular manner. It looks that way, conceded Aspwell, still bewildered. If I remember right, the coroner said something like that too. Let's have a look at the butler, instructed Logan. The sergeant left the room, returning in a few moments with the shaking and pale-faced butler in tow. Apparently Williams had been deeply shocked by the tragedy, for he spoke with great difficulty, and the muscles of his usually stony face twitched with mental anguish. He could do little more than repeat his previous statement regarding the time of Mayor Shelby's arrival and departure. He said he had heard no shot, nor had he been aware of any disturbance in the house, and he was positive that Cosgrove had had no callers after the mayor had left. In reply to a question, he stated that Shelby had seemed neither excited nor in an unusual hurry when he left the house. "But I know he's the man that did it, sir," he added shakily. "Nobody else could have done it, and I know the mayor wasn't on very good terms with Mr. Cosgrove." "That will do," said Logan, dismissing him. The butler, with head hanging low, walked out of the room. "Aspwell," said Logan, "get the mayor's house on the wire and ask the housekeeper if she can tell you anything about Mr. Shelby's movements this evening." While the sergeant proceeded to obey instructions, the inspector took out his lens and made a careful examination of the floor. In one of the corners, where a little dust had accumulated, he seemed to find something of interest. Producing a spiral tape line, he made a series of careful measurements, jotting down the results in a notebook. As he rose to his feet, Aspwell hung up the receiver. "The mayor's housekeeper says he left the house a little before 9, and she saw him come in about 10:20, he reported, regarding his superior with a dazed expression. Logan grinned. "That seems to agree with what Williams told us. What's this?" Stooping over the body, he untwisted several strands of hair woven around one of the fingers and held them to the light. Then, again producing his lens, he subjected each strand to a careful examination. "I saw that tuft of hair, sir," explained Aspwell, "but thought I'd leave it till you came. It's glossy black, same color as the mayor's," remarked Logan, as he carefully wrapped the strands in a piece of paper. "It's beginning to look bad for his honor." "I can't understand it," declared Aspwell. "Nobody would have thought that Mayor Shelby, thinking is a bad habit, Aspwell," interrupted the inspector sententiously. "We are supposed to deal in facts, not thoughts. What's junk?" He leaned over the table and glanced languidly at several articles arranged in a neat row. "Some of those things were scattered on the floor, and I picked them up," explained the sergeant. Yawning, as if the matter were of slight importance, Logan examined the articles one by one. "Very bad form for a man to leave a bunch of souvenirs behind him when he commits a murder," he remarked. "Our honorable mayor seems to be a careless cuss. Here we have a cuff button with an ornamental S on it. And here is a handkerchief with the mayor's initial embroidered in the corner. Some sport our mayor is. And finally," picking up the pistol by the handle, "we come to the most important thing in the collection, the gat the job was done with. One empty shell in the chamber, I see, and several fingerprints on the handle." "I noticed them, sir," said Aspwell. "There are some on the desk too, and as near as I could make out with the lens, they are all alike." He must have been terribly excited, leaving all those clues behind him. "I suppose he lost the cuff button in the scuffle." "Scuffle?" echoed the inspector, fixing Aspwell with his gentle blue eyes. "There must have been a scuffle," argued the sergeant. "That's how Cosgrove got those strands of hair twisted around his finger." Logan pursed his lips reflectively. "It would seem so, wouldn't it? But if there was a scuffle, it must have been one-sided, save for the hair pulling. Clothes, you'll notice, haven't been ruffled at all. Even his tie's on as straight as it can be." "Funny," acknowledged the sergeant, surveying the dead man's attire. "And here's another queer thing," pursued the inspector. "Those hairs weren't pulled out by the roots, but were cut off clean, as with a knife. I looked at them through the lens a few minutes ago." The sergeant stared, then shook his head dazedly. "I don't get it all," he mumbled. The inspector, rocking slowly on his heels, picked up the handkerchief. "This is another funny one. A handkerchief doesn't usually fall out of a man's pocket by accident. Shelby must have pulled it out. Why do you suppose he did that?" "Why, to use it, of course." Logan held the square of linen against the light. "But it hasn't been used, Aspwell. It's absolutely clean." Aspwell shrugged as if the proposition were quite beyond him. "Search me. One thing is sure as death and taxes, though. Shelby did it. All these clues." "Yes, I know, and that's just where the trouble comes in. Where there are so many clues, all pointing in the same direction, it's almost a cinch that the man they're pointing to is innocent." "You always say that," reminded the sergeant, a little impatiently. Logan grinned. "And I'm usually right too." Aspwell swallowed hard. "But this is an open and shut case against the mayor. We know he called on Cosgrove tonight. Williams found the body a short while after he left, and I've heard it whispered that they weren't any too good friends. I don't see what more evidence you want." The inspector, hands in trouser pockets and head wagging, swung about the room a couple of times. "It would be an open and shut case, but for one thing, the mayor was here tonight. There's no getting around that. But here's the ticklish point, Aspwell. Not even an idiot would spill so many clues, and the mayor is no idiot. He has his funny little ways, but he is a mighty smart man. And such a man, no matter how excited, wouldn't sprinkle so many clues over the landscape. That's what makes me think he didn't do it." The sergeant's lips opened a little, and there was a glimmer of understanding in his grey eyes. You think the mayor was framed by somebody?" he exclaimed. "You think the murderer left this bunch of clues to incriminate him?" Logan seemed to consider the idea. He stopped in front of the desk and looked across the mahogany surface at the dead man. "Maybe," he said. "I think we'll hear what the mayor himself thinks about it. Wish you'd run over and get him, Aspwell." The sergeant stared at his chief for an instant, opened his mouth as if to speak, but changed his mind and stepped briskly from the room. For several minutes after he had gone, the inspector remained standing at the desk, his indolent blue eyes flitting about the room. Then he crossed the floor and carefully ran his fingers over the opposite wall. His search proving fruitless, he turned his attention to a small upholstered couch standing nearby. His fingers explored the leathern surface inch by inch. Suddenly, a low chuckle indicated that he had found something interesting. "So that's it," he exclaimed elatedly. Then, as if another problem was still awaiting solution, he looked up toward the ceiling, contemplated the door for a few moments, then stole softly from the room. Chapter 3. A sharp rap on the door aroused Mayor Shelby from a half-stupor into which he had fallen, after vainly cudgelling his brains to find a satisfactory solution to the problem presented by the episode that had taken place in Cosgrove's house. "Gentleman downstairs wishes to see you, sir," came the housekeeper's somewhat excited voice. Shelby jerked himself erect. In another moment he was fully awake and conscious of a tingling sensation. "I'll be right down," he announced, jumping from the armchair in which he had been sitting. His mind worked with the rapidity of lightning as he hastened into the adjoining bathroom for a cold shower. He surmised that the murder had been discovered by this time, and he thought it only natural that he should be asked for an explanation. It was still possible that his ruse, based on Inspector Logan's suspicious attitude toward clues, would succeed. If it failed, he would at least have the satisfaction of knowing that he had given himself a fighting chance. His eyes gleamed aggressively as, followed by Sergeant Aspwell, he stepped into Cosgrove's den half an hour later. At the desk, regarding him with a quizzical, half-humorous expression, stood Inspector Logan. The swivel chair was vacant, the body having been removed during the sergeant's absence. The inspector's deceptively lazy eyes seemed to look through and beyond the mayor, but Shelby met the gaze unflinchingly. "These your things, Mr. Mayor?" inquired Logan, indicating the clues. Shelby glanced at the articles, muttered something under his breath, and made a skillful show of amazement. "I suppose you know that Cosgrove was murdered this evening?" continued the inspector, speaking in his customary drawling tones. "Sergeant Aspwell told me on the way over." The mayor's voice was shocked but non-committal. "And you called on Cosgrove tonight? I understand." A shrewd grin creased the inspector's features. "Sergeant Aspwell," with a wink at that dignitary, "thinks you've been framed, that the murderer got hold of these things of yours by some hook or crook and left them on the scene of the crime to incriminate you. I don't agree with him." "No?" The mayor's tones trembled slightly. He knew he had taken a long and slender chance, but he had hoped that the ruse would give him at least a few hours' respite and time to consider the situation calmly. He detected a disquieting quality in the inspector's voice. Would he have acted more wisely if he had fled? But even now the thought of flight was repellent. "You see, Mr. Mayor," continued the inspector coolly, "no man in his senses would have left all these clues behind him. That's why Aspwell thinks somebody has been framing you. The reason I disagree with him is that a man wise enough to pull off a framing stunt wouldn't have overdone it. He would have left one or two clues and let it go at that. He wouldn't have spoiled his game by leaving so many." Shelby's eyes narrowed as he realized that he had made a blunder. The horror that had gripped him upon seeing Cosgrove's body crumple back in the chair had stunted his reason and deprived him of his wits. A reckless smile parted his lips. It was not the first time in his career that he had gambled and lost. "All right," he declared with a shrug. "I see the game is up. I took a long chance, the only chance I had, and lost. I killed Cosgrove." An inscrutable impression came into the inspector's face. "I see," he drawled. "In fact, I reasoned the thing out before you came. Knowing I am leery of clues when they come in bunches, you thought you would play a trick on me. It might have worked if you hadn't overreached. Would you mind telling me where you stood when you fired the shot?" "Right where you are standing now." "Thought so. Between us three and the fence post, I never had much use for Cosgrove, and it's my opinion that he got just what was coming to him. But a fellow has to do his duty. Aspwell, will you entertain the mayor while I step out for a moment?" Both the sergeant and the mayor stared after him perplexedly as he walked from the room. The moment grew into minutes, and the minutes into a quarter of an hour. Then the door opened again, and the inspector pushed Williams, the butler, into the den. "Here's the man that killed Cosgrove," he announced. "He has just confessed." A mutter of incredulity slipped from the mayor's lips. Sergeant Aspwell stared crestfallen, first at the inspector, then at the trembling butler. The latter looked as if every ounce of strength had been drained from him. "Are you crazy?" exclaimed Shelby. "Oh, no," said Inspector Logan. "The thing is plain enough. It was the slanting course taken by the bullet that gave me the solution, for it proved that the shot had been fired from an elevation. A man facing Cosgrove across this desk could not have fired it, especially if he was a man of about Cosgrove's own height." But, stuttered the mayor. "I'll give it to you in a few words," declared Logan listlessly. "You'll notice that this desk is in almost direct line with the door. You'll also notice that there is a transom above the door. The glass is heavy and almost soundproof. While Aspwell was gone, I discovered that the transom could be pried open from the outside. As a matter of fact, there were scratches on the frame, showing that a knife or chisel had been used. The fatal bullet, gentlemen, was fired through the transom. The man who fired it stood on a chair, but the chair wasn't quite high enough, proving that he was a short man, shorter than you, Mr. Mayor. So the man that fired the shot took a thick book and placed it on the chair. I noticed a while ago that there were footmarks on a dictionary in the adjoining room, and I satisfied myself that they corresponded in size with the shoes Williams wears." The mayor still seemed incredulous. "After discovering that," continued the inspector, It wasn't hard to squeeze a confession out of Williams. He's a loyal cuss, and he was devoted to his master. Tonight he heard sounds of a heated quarrel in the den and stepped to the door to listen. It seems Cosgrove had given him strict orders not to interrupt conferences with his associates, so Williams didn't dare to enter. As the quarrel grew noisier, he climbed up on the chair and pried the transom open with his knife. Both of you were too excited to hear the noise. Well, he saw you, Mr. Mayor, threatening Cosgrove with a pistol. Williams has carried a gun for years, expecting that his master would someday get into a scrape of some sort. Frightened by what he saw, he drew it and aimed at your head, Mr. Mayor, and yanked away at the trigger. But in the same instant, Cosgrove threw the telephone at you, and you dodged, so Williams's bullet hit Cosgrove instead. Shelby blinked his eyes bewilderedly. "But I fired a shot," he exclaimed. "I know I did, for the barrel of the pistol was still warm a few minutes later." "Oh sure, but there were 2 shots," explained Logan, and Shelby remembered the long, drawn-out roar that had come just before Cosgrove dropped, and reflected that the 2 cracks could easily have merged into one. "Your aim was deflected when Cosgrove threw the telephone at you, and your bullet went into the couch over there. Here it is." The inspector threw a leaden missile on the table. "Care to keep it for a souvenir?" Shelby fingered the bullet with an abstracted air. "Williams isn't very long on nerve," continued the inspector. "When he saw what he had done, he got panicky. Then it occurred to him that the simplest way out of the fix was to stand aside and let things take their course. I guess we'll forgive him in consideration of his loyalty to his master. Both of you are in something of a mess, though. I understand your position, Mr. Mayor. Williams told me what he heard of the conversation between you and Cosgrove, but I have a very short memory. I like a man that's willing to take a fighting chance. We've got to get you and Williams out of this mess, though." He paced the floor with long, lunging strides, then stopped abruptly. "Aspwell, there have been a lot of burglars prowling about this part of town lately." The sergeant stared for a moment, then grinned. "Yes, sir, they've been working overtime around here for some weeks, and some of them are real desperate. Handy with the gats, too. I guess we can fix up something." "Thanks, Inspector," murmured Shelby, gripping Barney Logan's husky hand. "I gambled on you and won, though not in the way I expected." "Fool's luck," said the inspector, chuckling. "But I guess we're all fools at times. Good night, Mr. Mayor." End of Souvenirs by Herman Landon.